Jews have read the Torah over and over and over again. There's a tradition that the Torah has been divided up into 54 Torah portions, and they're assigned to different weeks in the year, such that over the course of an entire calendar year, you can read the entire Torah portion if you follow the one-year cycle. There's also a 3-year cycle in other communities, but most Jews tend to follow the one-year cycle. And there's a long tradition in Jewish life of not only reading the Torah text, but trying to make sense of it, to figure out what does it mean. It's not just the Torah, it's also the commentary. It's its application to life. And so I have here on our stand some examples of Torah commentary. This is the 5 books of Miriam, which is a women's commentary on the Torah. This is another book called the Women's Torah Commentary, with 54 different authors contributing. There is a novel simply on the book of Genesis by an Orthodox Jewish feminist that's 450 pages long. There is the Sonsino Chumash, which was a commentary edited by the former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom. There is the Reform Movement's Torah commentary. There is a commentary by Richard Elliott Friedman, a biblical scholar who wrote the Bible and is well versed in archaeology and the critical theory of the Torah. And this is the tip of the iceberg for Jewish commentaries on the Bible and commentaries on the commentaries on the commentaries. And all of them are trying to decide, what does this text mean? But it sort of begs another question. What does it mean to whom? What does it mean where and when? That makes a difference, you see. It's not just as if there's one author's intent that we can find out and it was always the same everywhere. Even in traditional rabbinic understanding, they said there are 70 faces to the Torah. They may mean different things to different people. And so 2 lenses we're going to look at tonight for reading a text are critical concepts I want to try to explain: intertextuality and reader response. Intertextuality says that anytime you read a text, it's in the conceptual context of other texts that have been written. So if you read a modern poem that references Absalom from the Hebrew Bible or Adam and Eve, what that does is it draws that other text of the Genesis creation story and places it next to the poem you're writing now or reading now and forces you to compare the two. Why are they using those character names for that setting? And it also transforms the original text, because now when you go back and read Genesis, you're going to be thinking of that other poem that referenced Adam and Eve and did it in a subversive way. So that's the intertextual idea, that texts are always put next to other texts that are in a tradition of texts responding to what people have written before. The second is called reader response, and what that means is when anybody reads a particular book or a passage or a poem, they bring themselves to it, their experiences, their emotional attachments, their triggers, their excitement, the other books that they've read in the past. Every reader is going to read it slightly differently. It's really a dialogue between the reader and the words on the page. And sometimes what the author meant is not that important. There's a wonderful anecdote with Umberto Eco, who writes very complicated novels about medieval Europe. And in one of his novels, he included a scene where the hero's antagonist says almost the same thing the hero did 15 pages before. And when asked about it in an interview after the book came out, he said, well, actually, it was a mistake, because the editor told me I needed another speech to transition from this scene to that scene, so I wrote something off fast, and I forgot that I'd had the same argument made by the other guy. And some of the reviewers had read it saying, well, clearly he's saying that truth is indeterminate and people will say whatever they want. And no, it was a mistake. But because Eco is versed in this reader response there, he said, that's fine. It has a life of its own. It's whatever I put out there, and then what they're going to get out of it is what they're going to get out of it. So that's the other lens, is the reader response. Who's reading it and when and why and what are they bringing to the text? So it's really 2 pieces, 2 lenses. Text or intertextuality and context. Text and context. Now tonight's Torah portion is called Bishalach, which means in the sending forth. This is the sending forth of the Israelites from their slavery in Egypt. And it appears in the book of Exodus between chapters 13 and 17. We'll look at the text in a few minutes. This is after the 10 plagues have struck Pharaoh and the Egyptians, and the Israelites are told, now you get to leave. Now we understand this narrative as mythology rather than history. It's a story that was written by later generations to justify their religious beliefs and practices. It was a way to explain where their people had come from, how they had created a nation, and it recommitted them to a core identity, ultimately around a revelation from a God. The people who are leaving are going to wind up at a mountain. That mountain we know as Mount Sinai, unless it's called Mount Horeb, because it has two different names in the text. But the end result is the Exodus is not important just for the leaving. It's the leaving, the wandering, the covenant, and ultimately the arrival in a promised land. That's where the Torah ends, just on the verge of entering the promised land. So this is their mythology to explain it, but we don't necessarily have to take it as history. However, imagine if you were a refugee, an exile, a wandering Jew, or a wandering anyone reading this passage. It would resonate differently. Hearing about leaving the place you know, going off to a new place you hope is better, dealing with trials along the way. That's the refugee experience as it's also described in this Torah portion. As I mentioned tonight, many congregations are observing Refugee Shabbat, a sponsored initiative by the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which was initially founded to help Hebrew immigrants. But since there weren't that many Hebrew immigrants by the 1990s, the organization decided, let's shift our focus. We will be the Hebrews helping immigrants. And so it's Jews helping as opposed to Jews helping Jews. That's been the shift. And they emphasize in their materials, but especially in encouraging people to celebrate this Shabbat, the fact that the command to love the stranger is repeated over 30 times over the course of the whole Torah, the first 5 books. That you should love the stranger, especially because you were a stranger yourself in the land of Egypt. If you suffered, help those who suffered like you. Now, I spoke at Kol Hadash a few months ago about the global refugee crisis, of millions of people not living where they're from, or not living where they would want to be, if not for what is where they're from. And if we're looking through this lens of text and context, here's a text that we're going to compare to this Torah portion. It's a poem called Home, written by Warshan Shire, who herself was from Somali parents who were born, she was born in Kenya, but her parents were Somali refugees. She herself now lives in London, so this question of what's home and what's safety is very important in her family story. And this poem speaks about why one becomes a refugee or why one leaves what one thinks of as home. Now, I will warn you, there are references to violence and to rape in this poem, so be aware that that is part of the story, but unfortunately, that is part of the reality of the refugee experience. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as well. Your neighbors running faster than you, breath bloody in their throats. The boy you went to school with who kissed you dizzy behind the old tin factory is holding a gun bigger than his body. You only leave home when home won't let you stay. No one leaves home unless home chases you, fire under feet, hot blood in your belly. It's not something you ever thought of doing until the blade burnt threats into your neck, and even then you carried the anthem under your breath, only tearing up your passport in an airport toilet, sobbing as each mouthful of paper made it clear that you won't be going back. You have to understand that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. No one burns their palms under trains beneath carriages. No one spends days and nights in the stomach of a truck feeding on newspaper unless the miles traveled mean something more than journey. No one crawls under fences. No one wants to be beaten, pitied. No one chooses refugee camps or strip searches where your body is left aching, or prison, because prison is safer than a city of fire. And one prison guard in the night is better than a truckload of men who look like your father. No one could take it. No one could stomach it. No one's skin would be tough enough. The go-home blacks, refugees, dirty immigrants, asylum seekers sucking our country dry, niggers with their hands out, they smell strange, savage, messed up their country, and now they want to mess ours up. How do the words, the dirty looks roll off your backs? Because maybe the blow is softer than a limb torn off. Or the words more tender than 14 men between your legs, or the insults are easier to swallow than rubble, than bone, than your child body in pieces. I want to go home, but home is the mouth of a shark. Home is the barrel of the gun, and no one would leave home unless home chased you to the shore, unless home told you to quicken your legs, leave your clothes behind, crawl through the desert, wade through the oceans, drown, save, be hunger, beg, forget pride. Your survival is more important. No one leaves home until home is a sweaty voice in your ear saying, leave. Run away from me now. I don't know what I've become, but I know that anywhere is safer than here. That's a text. This is why people leave, with all they have to brave, with all the challenges, because home is the mouth of a shark. Keep this in mind as we go through the story of the Exodus. So what is our context, we who are Jewish readers in the 21st century? Well, I would argue it's the awareness that we have been those refugees. Our ancestors over and over decided that home had become the mouth of a shark and the barrel of a gun, and they had to make their home somewhere else. Here's a quick list of Jewish expulsions over history, and they go on and on and on. In 733, you have an expulsion under the Assyrians and a final destruction of the northern kingdom in 722. In 587 BCE, the temple is destroyed in Jerusalem and Jews are exiled to Babylon. They get to return under the Persians after about 80 years, but they're expelled from the city of Rome under an accusation of proselytizing in 139 BCE. Again expelled from Rome in 19 CE. Expelled from one of the quarters of the city of Alexandria in 38 CE. They're defeated in the First Roman-Jewish War in 73 CE with the destruction of the temple. Large Jewish communities in Cyprus, Cyrene, and Alexandria are wiped out after what's called sometimes the Diaspora Rebellion. Jews are expelled from Alexandria again in 415, expelled from Minorca in 418. The Visigoths give the Jews a year to leave or be banished. The Jewish population of Galilee is massacred after a rebellion against Byzantium. Muhammad expels 2 Jewish tribes from Medina as part of his rise to power. They're expelled from Mainz in Germany in 1012. They're destroyed during the Crusades in the 11th century to the 13th century. They're expelled from Upper Bavaria in 1276. They're expelled from France in the 12th to 14th centuries. Famously, they're expelled from England in 1290, and then, of course, expelled from Spain in 1492, but also expelled from different regions in Germany over the course of the 15th century, ultimately expelled from Portugal as well and forced to convert. They're expelled from parts of Italy, again from parts of central Germany. That's how they wind up in Poland, speaking Yiddish, which is medieval German. They were in Germany and then were pushed out. And so on and so on. Expelled from Vienna, expelled from Yemen, expelled from Haiti. The story of the wandering Jew is not just a myth. It's the Jewish experience. Even into the 20th century, with all the Jews fleeing pogroms, and fleeing the destruction of the Holocaust, and fleeing the persecution they felt in Arab lands after the founding of the State of Israel, from North Africa and Iraq and Yemen and Iran, and all these countries where they had roots going back over 1,000 years. They had to leave because home was the mouth of a shark. And so this story of Exodus has resonance for them too. In fact, one of the earliest operations to move Jews, I believe it was the Jews from Yemen, was called Operation Exodus. Because here we go again. We're going to bring them back to what we hope is the Promised Land. So you can see that the story of the Exodus has been ever relevant through Jewish history. It's why we hope that the next leaving will be to a promised land with divine promises and protection. And it may be that this narrative that we're going to see was edited into its final form during that Babylonian exile or after our return. And then it makes sense because it was a promised land return after that exile, at least for a time. Text and context, refugee and expulsion, global crisis, and the Jewish experience. And so with that, we'll turn to look at Exodus chapter 13 and the beginning of our Torah portion. So again, Bishalach is the name of the Torah portion. Usually the Torah portion is taken from one of the first words of that Torah portion. In this case, it matches the meaning of the section. It's not always the case. Sometimes it's just Shemot, the names. That doesn't really help you. But in this case, it does. So when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not take them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although it was nearer. There's a lot of, Facebook memes about why the Jews got lost for 40 years in the desert, because nobody would ask for directions, or people do a Google Maps walking from the pyramids to Jerusalem, and how long would it actually take if you were walking on foot in a straight line. Well, this is arguing a little bit about why they didn't do that. They couldn't go through the coastal plain because that's where the Philistines were. Now that does date it to a certain time. The Philistines show up in the Near East from Greek islands around the year 1200 BCE. So this is happening at some point after that in the chronology of the mythical history. And why? Well, because God says the people might have a change of heart. If they see a settled army there, they may go back to Egypt. And the number one goal is, once they've left, don't go back. Don't give up. Part of the goal of the story is to encourage them to keep on. And so they go the long way around, by the wilderness of the, sometimes translated Sea of Reeds or the Red Sea. It's that big body of water between the Sinai Peninsula and Egypt. That's the way to get through. Now, you will sometimes get people who say, well, it really was a Sea of Reeds, like a marshland, because they're trying to find a natural explanation for the wonders that took place. They're the ones who would say, well, you had the plague of darkness, which was caused by the flies, and that caused the cattle disease from the lice, and then when the cattle died, it caused the death of the firstborn. And they're trying to find a natural explanation for what in the story is a miracle. And a miracle upon miracle upon miracle. And the point of it is violating the natural order of things. So in this story, where Moses will part the waters and walk through on dry land, as it says, it doesn't matter if it's a marsh or not. It wasn't a big wind that showed up and made it a little bit easier and then the chariots got stuck. We don't need to rationalize it to try to find a way for it to have actually happened. We're willing to say this is a story and it's made wonderful. This is the ancient equivalence of CGI special effects, is giving you a big story with big wonders and, as we'll see, big imaginary FX, and this is the best they could do at that time. Now Moses, when leaving, takes with him the bones of Joseph, who had said, please make sure to bring my bones with me. Interesting, this does violate a later rabbinic prohibition on disturbing Jewish bones in a grave. You're not allowed to do that in rabbinic practice, but occasionally it is done. And it has been done before for other famous people. Famously, Zev Jabotinsky, who was a right-wing ideologue in the pre-state Zionist movement, died in New York and was buried outside of the land of Israel. And it took about 10 or 15 years for the modern state of Israel to agree to move his bones and bury him there. Same thing happened to Theodor Herzl. He was also reinterred in the land of Israel. So it has been done by the more secular parts of the Jewish world. But interesting that Moses is a precedent for that, because he wants to take Joseph back with him. They set out from Sukkot, camped in Eitam. We don't really know where these places are. Again, these are places that the people hearing the story might have known, but we don't have that context. And then notice what their guiding light is, literally. Yahweh went before them, that's their God, in a pillar of cloud by day to guide them along the way, and a pillar of fire by night to give them light, so they could travel day and night. But they have a guide, and a miraculous guide. And again, you don't have to explain, was this a tornado, or was this some kind of like northern lights that they were... No, this is a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire. You can't see God directly, of course. That's one of the ideological claims of a strand in the Hebrew Bible. But you can at least see the wondrous sign that he's leaving. And also notice the parallel. There's another part in the Exodus story where God appears through fire. You remember when that was? The burning bush, exactly. So this is another burning bush-like episode. And when God appears on Mount Sinai to give the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20, he also appears with a lot of fire. So he's sort of a volcanic fire god, if you want to think of it that way. And those pillars did not depart from the people. So now God says to Moses, tell the Israelites to turn back and camp between Migdol and the sea, and camp facing it next to the sea. And Yahweh predicts what's going to happen. Pharaoh will say of the Israelites, the wilderness has caught them. And then hear what Yahweh the God is going to do. I will stiffen Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them, that I may gain glory through Pharaoh and all of his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am Yahweh. So why is he causing Pharaoh to get mad and come after them? To show off. He wants to demonstrate how powerful he is. As if he hasn't already, with all the plagues and other things no, he needs to teach them another lesson. And not just them, of course, but all the other peoples who might hear the story. What it actually reminds me of is the second atomic bomb. You recall the first atomic bomb is dropped on Hiroshima. It's cataclysmic disaster. And then we dropped another one at Nagasaki. And we dropped another one even though we knew the Japanese were being in touch with the Russians to try to sue for peace. We didn't drop it to get the Japanese to surrender. We dropped the second one to show the Russians we could do it again. It was a demonstration of power on the Japanese to show the Russians that we meant business. Sort of like this, is causing the Egyptian army to get destroyed to show everybody else that he's Yahweh and has a lot of power. Now, when the king of Egypt was told the people had fled, they had a change of heart. Said, what have we done? Letting them go from their slavery. And so he ordered his chariot, took his force with him, 600 of his chariots with officers in them. And here it says again, and Yahweh stiffened the heart of Pharaoh, and he gave chase to the Israelites as they were departing. The Egyptians gave chase. You notice how that it sort of repeats itself a little bit? They gave chase, and then they gave chase. That's one of the clues that this may have been a kind of oral story that was told. You have that kind of phrased repetition if you look at the Odyssey or the Iliad. Those also have signs of that oral culture that eventually gets written down. And so they give chase. They finally overtake them encamped by the sea. Now when the Israelites see the Egyptians advancing upon them, they cry out to Yahweh. And they say to Moses, and this is perhaps the most Jewish line in the entire Torah because it's so sarcastic. Was it for lack of graves in Egypt that you brought us to die in the wilderness? There were no graves in Egypt, so you wanted to kill us, and so you brought us out here to die? What have you done to us, taking us out of Egypt? And Moses is saying, are you kidding me? We were slaves there for 400 years. They tried to kill our firstborn. They almost killed me. I was saved in the basket, right? What do you mean you want to go back to Egypt? You were happy when we were leaving. And the people go on. Is this not the very thing we told you in Egypt, saying, let us be, and we will serve the Egyptians. It's better for us to serve the Egyptians than die in the wilderness. Why are you messing with things? Everything was fine. That's what they're saying now. But Moses said to the people, have no fear. Stand by and witness the deliverance that Yahweh will work for you today. For the Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. Hear that word witness. This whole story is a story of witness, of testimony. Look at all the things that Yahweh did for you. And all the people, the whole nation saw it happen. That's part of the claim of those later generations of why you should obey all these rules. Because look what he did. Look at all these wonders that everybody saw. It's an argument for faith and obedience. Yahweh will battle for you. You hold your peace. Don't worry. He fights for you. He's sometimes called Yahweh Tzivaot, the God of armies, the Lord of hosts. You might hear it in English. So now Yahweh says to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to go forward. You lift up your rod and hold your arm over the sea, and Cecil B. DeMille will split it. That's the 1950s version. Actually, if you know, they had it open and they let the waters go and poured in and then ran the film backwards, and that's how they got it to look like that back then. You hold your arm over the sea and split it, and the Israelites will march into the sea on dry ground. So it'll be as if there had never been any water there before. I will stiffen the hearts of the Egyptians so they go in after you, and I will gain glory again through Pharaoh and his warriors, his chariots and riders. Let the Egyptians know that I am Yahweh when I gain glory through them. And again repeats the phrasing. Now the angel of God, the Malach, the messenger, had been going ahead of the Israelite army, now moved behind them, and the pillar of cloud took up a place behind them as a barrier between them and the Egyptians. And the cloud came with darkness, it cast a spell on the night so they couldn't attack overnight. And during that time, Moses held his arm out over the sea. Yahweh drove back the sea with a strong east wind and turned the sea into dry ground. The waters were split, and the Israelites went into the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. Again, this is the special effects, right? You can visualize a wall of water on either side. Even more impressive than the aquarium. The Egyptians came in pursuit after them into the sea, all of the horses, chariots, and riders. And at the morning watch, Yahweh looked down upon the Egyptian army from a pillar of fire and cloud and threw them into panic. He locked or stuck the wheels of their chariots so they could not move forward except with difficulty. And the Egyptians said, "Let us flee. Yahweh's fighting for them against us. We can't fight Yahweh." Now Yahweh says to Moses, who is his agent and emissary, "Hold your arm over the sea, and the waters come back upon the Egyptians and upon their riders." He did so, and at daybreak the sea returned to its normal state. The Egyptians fled at its approach, but Yahweh threw the Egyptians into the sea. The waters turned back and covered the chariots and riders, the entire army, not one of them remained. But the Israelites had marched through on dry ground. Again, what a wonder, what a powerful God who's done this. Now, if you have to flee a country, wouldn't that be the way to go? If you had a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire leading you, causing these wonders to happen, someone tries to attack you, it's going to interfere and block them, and then you cross the water, and then you can destroy them with your own arm, and you let the waters fall, and they're drowned, and you'll never see them again. If you're going to flee, that's refugee in style, right? That's how to go. They saw the Egyptians dead on the shore of the sea, and when they saw the wondrous power which he had wielded against them, they feared. They had faith in Yahweh. Now this is sort of an odd phrasing. It says in Hebrew, "V'ya'aminu b'Yahweh." They believed in God. But if you had seen all those things, is it really sort of a philosophical debate for you? Do I believe in a God or not? I mean, I've just seen these clouds and fires and water. No, of course you'd believe. It's just you have faith, you have confidence in this God that he will in fact do what he's promised to do. Now, chapter 15 is a very famous passage called the Song at the Sea. We're actually not going to delve into it too much. It actually is retelling a lot of what we just saw in the previous two chapters. But it's thought to be one of the oldest passages in the Hebrew Bible. Again, with that oral character, a song that kind of rhymes and flows is more likely to be an older text, and some of the vocabulary that's used also indicates a somewhat older composition. And you have very famous lines in here. Yahweh the warrior, Yahweh is his name. Pharaoh's army, chariots and army he cast into the sea. Your right hand is glorious in power. Your right hand shatters the foe. Again, you could ask, a hand? Well, this is a metaphor for power, maybe. And then the famous lines a little further down. Mi kamocha ba'elim. Who is like you among the gods? What? The gods? Well, you'll notice here it says, who is like you among the celestials? Or other translations, if you look at the footnote, says, among the mighty. But the Hebrew word is elim, which means gods, like El is God. So it makes sense that this was a celebration of Yahweh defeating the Egyptian gods. Who is like, you're the best God ever. It's not that there aren't other gods, there are, but you're better than all of them. You're the strongest God. My dad can beat up your dad. My God can beat up your God. And then at the end of the song, a very fascinating episode takes place. This is in verse 20. Then Miriam, the prophet or prophetess, Haniviyah, Aaron's sister and Moses' sister, picked up a hand drum, some translate it as a tambourine. And all the women went out after her in dance with these hand drums. And Miriam sang for them, or chanted for them, "Sing to Yahweh, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and driver he has hurled into the sea." It's a quoting of the first line of Moses' song, more or less, a slight difference. But what I love about this passage is, first of all, you have a woman prophet, a prophetess. You have playing instruments and singing, despite the Orthodox prohibition on women singing. You have dance being part of a Jewish practice and celebration. And you have sort of a, not separate but equal, it's still unequal, but some sense that the women can have an active role to play in Jewish communal memory. In fact, the Haftorah, or the reading from later in the Hebrew Bible attached to this Torah portion, is the story of Deborah, who's also a woman, a leader, a judge, and ultimately leads the Hebrews in battle in the book of Judges. So they set out from the Sea of Reeds. They came to a place called Mara, which means bitter, but they couldn't drink the water of Mara, bitter, because it was bitter. That's why it was called Mara. Very simple origin story for the name of that place. And guess what starts? The kvetching. The people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" So he cried out to Yahweh, and Yahweh showed him a piece of wood. He threw it in the water, and the water became sweet. This was made a fixed rule. They were put to the test, but they're putting God to the test too. And here's the key lesson from this Exodus narrative. If you will listen to your God diligently, do what's upright in his sight, giving ear to his commandments and keeping all of his laws, then I will not bring upon you any of the diseases that I brought upon the Egyptians. I, Yahweh, am your doctor, am your healer. This is, again, the kind of promise a refugee would want, right? Just tell me what I have to do. Give me something predictable. Part of the reason people flee is the anarchy that takes place when society breaks down. Give me some rules. Give me some structure. I'll accept stability. Even under the price of oppression, I'll accept stability. And so this is also a promise. In many ways, this story is describing the emotional needs that a refugee might have as they're leaving Egypt. And so they set out, ultimately getting to the wilderness of Sin on the way to Sinai. And there again, they grumbled against Moses and Aaron. More kvetching. What's the complaint this time? If only we had died by the hand of Yahweh in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and we ate our fill of bread. They were thirsty before, right? What are they now? Hungry. What about the meat? What about the bread? You brought us out in the wilderness to starve to death. Yahweh said to Moses, I will rain down bread for you from the sky. The people will go out and gather each day that day's portion. And this way I will test them to see if they follow my rules or not. So they might be asking for rules or wanting them, but also God is saying, I need to train these people into how to follow the rules. Because so far they're not doing so well. They'll get a daily dose, but on the sixth day, when they apportion what they have brought in, it will be double the amount they gathered for the other days. So what is that training them to do? If their main job to survive is to go out and get the food, the bread that's being produced, and they have to gather double on the sixth day, what do they not have to do on the seventh day? They don't have to do their job. They don't have to work. So it's beginning to train them into the idea of Shabbat. Just as Genesis begins with the creation of the world in 7 days in 6 days, and God rests on the seventh, so too the Exodus begins with, I'm going to train them into how to not work one day. After all, as slaves, they might have had to work all 7. By evening you will know that it was Yahweh that brought you out, and you won't grumble anymore. Who will give you flesh to eat in the evening and morning to the full? Your grumbling is against Yahweh, not us, but he will solve the problem anyways. And so now Aaron spoke to the whole community and communicated this message. Yahweh speaks again to Moses and says, by evening you will have flesh and by morning bread. And by evening, quail appeared and covered the camp. And then there was a fall of dew around the camp. And when the dew lifted, over the surface of the wilderness lay a fine and flaky substance, as fine as frost on the ground. When they saw it, they said to each other, what is it? But the word for what is it they use is manhu instead of mahu. Ma would be what normally in Hebrew, so they're making a pun. Ultimately, it becomes called man or manna. We sometimes describe manna from heaven. That's a phrase we use in English. It's this idea of this flaky, bready kind of substance that comes from the dew that crystallizes overnight. Now, evidently, there is a tamarisk tree that produces a kind of sap that drips that you can collect first thing in the morning, and it will dissolve by midday if the sun hits it. But it doesn't do everything that the manna does in this story, because again, this is magic stuff. This is not practical, real experience. So each household gathers as much as it requires to eat, and they do so. And as they measured it, everyone had the right amount. Again, magic, miracle. No one leave anything till morning, but they paid no attention to Moses. Again, they don't listen. Some of them left it until morning, and it became infested with maggots and stank. And Moses was angry with them. So they learned to gather it in the morning as much as they needed before it melted, and they would have enough. Again, what does the refugee need? Water, food. How do I survive? A basic human need. And on the 6th day they gathered double the amount of food, and he said, tomorrow is a day of rest, a holy Shabbat, a Shabbat Kodesh to Yahweh. Bake what you would bake and boil what you would boil, and don't do anything else. But of course, what do you expect? It says 6 days you gather it, on the 7th day you don't, and yet some of the people went out on the 7th day, just to check, right? What would it hurt? They found nothing. And Yahweh said to Moses, how long will you all refuse to obey my commandments and my teachings? Now, if you were in exile in Babylon, why would you keep having the people break the rules, and break the rules, and break the rules, and complain, and argue, and be ungrateful? Well, you have to explain why you got destroyed. If you had always followed the rules forever, you would still be in Jerusalem. But the fact that the temple was destroyed, the fact you were exiled to Babylon, came about because you didn't listen. And you broke the rules, and it goes back to right at the beginning when you couldn't listen and you complained and you broke the rules. This is again making sense of disaster. Why did this happen? Something else that a refugee might ask, what happened to society and why did it collapse? And so the people learned to be inactive on the 7th day and to rest. They did save one omer, one dose of it throughout the ages as a memento, and they ate the manna for 40 years until they came to the land of Canaan, of Canaan. And then at the end of this story, this is the last chapter in this Torah portion, chapter 17, the people quarrel with Moses again. They say, give us water to drink. We're thirsty again. Moses says, why do you quarrel with me? Why are you testing Yahweh? Will you shut up? He's going to hear you and get mad. But the people thirsted for water and said again, why did you bring us from Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? And so now Moses is getting a little fed up. Look what he says. What shall I do with this people? Before long they will be stoning me. So Yahweh said to Moses, go before the people, take along a rod, the same rod you struck the Nile with to turn it into blood, strike a rock, and there will be water coming from it. And so he did so in front of the elders, and so they named the place Massah and Meribah, test and argument, because they quarreled, but in the end they got water. And then in verse 8, another nation appears. It's a nation called Amalek. In Yiddish you pronounce it Amalek. Amalek fights against the Israelites. In this case, the Israelites are successful. Whenever Moses holds up his arms, the Israelite armies are winning. If he gets tired and they fall down, the other side begins to win. And so ultimately, two of his priests, Aaron and Hur, hold up his arms for him, and they win. Again, is there a rational explanation? No. This is the magic power of Yahweh fighting, or in this case, Yahweh giving power to the people to fight. Now, why would he delegate his power to the people? Because in the experience of the people who wrote the story, they don't see pillars of cloud. They don't see pillars of fire. They don't see waters parting. They see armies fighting. If they're going to have confidence that Yahweh will fight with them instead of for them, in front of them, you have to translate it into the people acting instead. Ultimately, though, Yahweh is so mad at the people of Amalek. He says to Moses, inscribe this in a document as a reminder, read it aloud to Joshua. I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Now, what's the problem with that objective? I will blot out their memory from under heaven. Make sure to write this down in a document as a reminder. Wait a minute. I thought you were going to blot out their memory, but you have me write it down so I won't forget it. Well, this is the paradox here. Now, it may be the case their name wasn't Amalek at all. Their name was something else entirely, and so he has blotted out the memory, and we don't know what it was because we can just call him Amalek. But this is where that Jewish legacy of reading the story in the context of expulsion and exile over the centuries really comes to play. And that's the last point I want to make about this Torah portion. Over the centuries, Amalek becomes the stand-in for every enemy that the Jews have faced. Later in the Exodus narrative, they attack the Hebrews from behind, hitting the women, the children, the weakest of the group. And they are seen as the enemy that wants to destroy Israel. Amalek appears later during the time of King Saul as a snare and temptation to him. Even though he tries to destroy them, in the end they destroy him. He manages to spare their king Agag, which causes him to be destroyed. And then centuries later, in the story of Purim, what we read in the Megillah of Esther, Haman is described as an Agagite, a descendant of Agag, so he is also part of Amalek. You have Amalek, you have Agag, you have Haman, you have Rome, you have Islamic armies, you have the Crusades, you have Khmelnytsky and his pogroms in Ukraine, you have the Tsar and his pogroms under the end of the Tsar's Russia, you have the wars after between the Red Army and the White Army, you have Hitler, you have the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, or Nasser in Egypt. These are all, in that conceptual framework, a version of Amalek. Someone who hates the Jews and wants to destroy them, and often causes them to flee. And so this is why this story continues to have resonance. It's because of the ongoing context of the Jewish experience. And ideally, it does motivate us to have sympathy, to see in this mythical retelling of our origins an expression of human needs and the very basic needs of any refugee fleeing a place that has become the mouth of a shark. And so I hope it inspires us to compassion, to help those in need, and to particularly help those needing a home, a new home, that will not be the mouth of a gun, but instead can be an opportunity for new beginnings.